Welcome back to our second of three lectures on constitutionalism and the Constitution between populism and cosmopolitanism, a kind of broad theme that accommodates a wide variety of approaches, because that was my intent. Grateful once again to the Jack Miller Center for generously funding this, let's call it a mini conference. Our next speaker is Professor Sara Henary of Missouri State University. That's in Springfield, Missouri, if you want to know. Professor Henary received her bachelor's degree from Rhodes College in Memphis and her master's and Ph.D. from the University of Virginia. Prior to coming to Missouri State, she held visiting positions or postdoctoral fellowships at Princeton University, Wake Forest University, and at UVA. She is an associate professor, so which is to say newly tenured, and we can congratulate her for that. I told her when she told me about the news from Missouri State that it's rapidly becoming a center for the study of political thought in the middle of the United States, rivaling only those institutions in Texas. Dallas, Houston, North Texas, and what's the name of that school in Austin? Professor Henary writes widely on authors, some of whom are familiar to Oglethorpe students, especially those who have made it all the way through the core. She writes on John Locke. She writes on Alexis de Tocqueville. And then she writes on an English novelist who's one of my recent favorites. You've probably not heard of him, but I do strongly recommend him to you. His name is Anthony Trollope. 19th century English novelist who, if you want a very engaging discussion of the development of democracy and democratic politics out of aristocracy, there's no better place to begin. There's a lot more going on than that, but that's certainly one of the themes. Without further ado, I give you Professor Henary. Thank you for.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Knippenberg, for having me here at Oglethorpe. It's my first time on campus, and thank you all for being here on a Friday afternoon on such a nice day. I need to begin by announcing a title change. In the program, my talk is entitled Tocqueville on Belonging and Community in America, but as the talk took shape, my focus so again, my original title was Tocqueville on Belonging and Community in America, but as the talk developed, my focus gradually shifted to the relationship between citizenship and the Constitution. So on this celebration of Constitution Day, I want to consider the relationship between the Constitution and citizenship, specifically on what might constitute good citizenship in the U.S., how this is achieved, and the dangers associated with an absence of good citizenship. Tocqueville is still going to inform a lot of my talk, especially the latter half of my talk, but I'm going to focus less exclusively on him than I had originally planned. So if you want a new title for my talk, the new title is The Constitution and Good Citizenship. Before discussing the theme of good citizenship in the U.S., a few preliminaries are going to be in order. I'm first going to look at the concept of the good citizen. Because the concept of the good citizen is going to turn out to be relative to the regime, I need to briefly characterize the American political system. And then as a final preliminary, I'll discuss an older conception of good Republican citizenship that may be contrasted with more modern versions of citizenship. So first of all, let's talk about the idea of a good citizen. And for a general conception of good citizenship, there's no better place to go than to Aristotle and Aristotle's Politics. Assuming that one is a citizen of a particular political community, what does it mean to be a good citizen? In essence, a good citizen would be someone who performs the task of citizenship well, And according to Aristotle, the task of all citizens, however different they may be, is the stability of the association, that is, the stability of the Constitution or the regime. By this definition, a good citizen's job is everywhere the same, to support and maintain the political system, whatever that political system happens to be. However, and this is implied in the definition of good citizen, because regimes differ from one another, what supports the Constitution in one place is going to be different from what supports, what kind of citizenship supports the Constitution somewhere else. In other words, what good citizenship looks like is going to be relative to the regime. As Aristotle puts it, the virtue of the citizen must be in relation to the Constitution. And as there are more kinds of constitution than one, there cannot be just one single and perfect virtue of the sound citizen. If good citizenship is relative to the regime, it behooves us to know what kind of regime we have, because if we don't know what kind of regime we have, we can't know what sort of citizenship is necessary to sustain that regime. Now, you could characterize the American political system in all sorts of ways using different descriptions and different terms, but I am going to describe our political system or characterize it as a liberal democracy that is extended over a large territory, so a large liberal democracy. According to the political scientist James Caesar, who happened to be my mentor, and he's a well-known political scientist at the University of Virginia, the liberal element in liberal democracy indicates esteem for the key values of modern constitutionalism, such as the protection of rights, limited government, and deliberate decision-making processes. In liberal regimes, these values are promoted by various devices and mechanisms. So you have bills of rights, written constitutions, separation of powers, bicameralism, federalism, etc. So that's the liberal part of liberal democracy. Now let's say a little bit about the democracy part of that compound term, as Caesar puts it. The term democracy suggests rule by the people that promotes the common good, or at least the interests of a majority of the people in a particular society. So that's something about liberalism, something about democracy. The last part of my characterization, a liberal democracy extended over a large territory, is probably familiar to a lot of you who've read the Federalist Papers and just who've experienced American democracy. So our liberal democracy is represented and again extends over a large territory. James Madison observes in Federalist 10 that the simple fact that our nation is large means that American society is going to be diverse, comprising many different people who have many different interests. So we've talked about the concept of a good citizen. We've characterized the American political system as an extended liberal democracy. And now we're going to gradually approach a conception of citizenship that is appropriate for American liberal democracy. But first I want to spend some time talking about an older conception of Republican citizenship. So if America is an extended liberal democracy, it needs an appropriate conception of citizenship. And that conception of citizenship that's appropriate for us is going to be different from some older conceptions or more traditional conceptions of Republican and democratic citizenship. Just as an aside, kind of in conversation with Professor Gross's talk, I would like to point out just that the very, my talk assumes that that institutions are important for the maintenance of liberal democracy. That was a focus of his talk, but it assumes that institutions are not enough to maintain the American political system. You need more, and specifically, you need a conception of citizenship that's accessible to the average person. But again, before we talk about a conception of citizenship that is going to help sustain American liberal democracy, I want to say something, I want to do a comparison and spend a little bit of time saying something general about more traditional conceptions of good Republican citizenship. Historically, a common view of Republican or democratic citizenship was that citizens needed to be active in making policy directly or in making policy themselves. For example, one great proponent of direct rule by the people, whose name has come up several times already today, was Rousseau. And Rousseau argued for a form of active citizenship in which the people govern themselves directly without the aid or convenience of representatives. In his work, The Social Contract, Rousseau says, "The better a state is constituted, the more public business takes precedence over private business in the minds of citizens. In a well-run city, everyone flies to the assemblies. Under a bad government, no one wants to take a step to get to them, since no one takes an interest in what happens there." In Rousseau's view, it's the people who are sovereign, and the people need to do their own work. They don't need to depend on representatives to do it for them. This is, of course, a demanding and time-consuming form of government, but it's nonetheless the only form of government that Rousseau, as a more traditional Republican, he's a modern Republican, but he has in common with older conceptions of republicanism the idea that the people need to be directly responsible for public affairs, or you're more directly responsible for public affairs. This kind of direct popular control over the institutions of government is, of course, only possible in a small society where the people can easily assemble. But many thought that in the US, despite its large size, that this older Republican ideal should be approximated and approached as much as possible. For example, I know that some of you are reading the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debate in class, and the Anti-Federalists were prominent defenders of a more traditional Republican conception of citizenship. And many Anti-Federalists who opposed the Constitution believed that even if the United States was going to be too large to have direct democracy, so you were going to have representation of some sort, the people should still retain as much control as possible over representatives and over the institutions of government more generally. So, for example, there's a good article on the anti-federalist position by a political scientist named Herbert Storing, and when he's talking about what the anti-federalists wanted when it comes to what representative government would look like, they want term limits, they want very short terms of office, they want all of these ways of keeping Republican government as close to the people as possible. Of course, as defenders of the Constitution, the Federalists reject this thinking about the virtues of direct popular control over government, arguing instead that too much direct popular influence, in fact, destabilizes popular government and leads to worse political outcomes. While the framers did want the people to have a say in government, they thought that the people in general were too changeable and too poorly informed to make wise laws at the national level, a task that would be better performed by elected representatives. From a regime maintenance perspective, popular government should keep the people at some distance from government through representation and other devices such as written constitutions that protect rights from the abuses of tyranny of the majority. Another common view about traditional Republican or democratic citizenship is that the people should be well acquainted with one another and in fact similar to one another in various respects. The idea of being acquainted with one's fellow citizens didn't mean that you would necessarily know every single citizen, but it did mean that you would know the people in general around you well enough in order to understand their way of life and be able to relate to them. Discussing his ideal city, which features at least some direct involvement or some involvement in government by the people, Aristotle insists that the citizens of this ideal city must necessarily be familiar with one another's qualities. If one doesn't understand one's fellow citizens in some somewhat intimate sense, Aristotle thought that it wasn't possible to deal fairly with other people. He didn't think that you should judge someone that you don't understand or that you don't relate to. And he points out the connection between familiarity and similarity and size, whether large or small. The larger and more populous a political community, the harder it is, of course, to know one's fellow citizens, who are going to be numerous and in many cases more diverse than in less populous political communities. In the American context, again, to go back to the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, the Anti-Federalists shared this preoccupation with a small territory and similarity among the citizens themselves and between citizens and those who represented them. Without this kind of similarity and familiarity, citizens were going to have very different interests and ways of life, making it difficult for them to relate to one another and be adequately represented. Another way to make this point about people being acquainted with and familiar with one another and similar to one another as well would be to say that the traditional view of Republican or democratic citizenship encourages proximity and intimacy and close bonds among people. Needless to say, the United States is large and diverse, full of citizens who are not automatically bound together by similarity of background or some specific way of life. While the nation was certainly more homogeneous at the time of the founding, the inescapable diversity of a large nation was presented by the Federalists as an advantage. Again, to refer to Federalist 10, James Madison famously touches on the political advantages of diversity. Again, and this is a situation in which there was significant diversity in the United States already, but much less diversity than we have today. But Madison is seeing the logic of an extended republic. So Madison says that, again, talking about the political advantages of diversity, in a large nation, you're going to have a large number of factions or a large number of interests. In this situation, it's less likely that a majority interest or a majority faction will emerge. And if such an interest does emerge, the fact that citizens are very spread out makes it a challenge for that oppressive majority to organize and have its way with people, so to speak. So it's harder for it to organize and oppress others. That's just a little bit about a more traditional view of Republican citizenship, and I now want to shift to a discussion of liberal democracy and citizenship, so good citizenship in the context of American politics. What sort of regime-maintaining citizenship is possible for those who live in an extended liberal democracy, and how is this achieved? So we're going to talk about both what liberal democratic citizenship looks like and how you go about ensuring that such citizenship is possible. Here's where I'm going to draw heavily on the thought of Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. And in Democracy in America, in other places, but mainly in Democracy in America, he sketches a portrait of modern citizenship that is achievable for the average person. So he's not talking about kind of great citizens and great men and great women, but what's a conception of citizenship that's achievable for the average person and yet is sufficiently robust in order to sustain and maintain liberal democratic institutions? Tocqueville recognized that the days of spontaneous and unreflective patriotism were, for the most part, over, but he also recognized that a new, more rational, and perhaps more modest conception of citizenship was necessary. The scope of the U.S. and the structure of our national government, of course, by design, do not make it easy for average citizens to participate in national politics. And indeed, our representative system and just the scope of the territory presupposes that people are going to be spending an awful lot of time preoccupied with their private affairs, and the founders were, generally speaking, fine with that. Citizens are not expected to run to the National Assembly, as Rousseau would put it. However, while at the national level, our regime does not require highly active citizenship, the sound functioning of our national politics require that citizens be at least somewhat attentive to national affairs. At the very least, ordinary citizens must have sufficient political knowledge and judgment to identify public officials who are going to be good guardians of their interests as well as good guardians of the common good. Now, of course, some citizens might choose to be more active in national politics by joining or leading interest groups, phoning their elected representatives, and so on. But again, I'm following Tocqueville and being focused on what the average person, what you can reasonably expect of an average citizen. So just starting with the idea that it's important that not every single citizen, but a significant percentage of citizens need to be paying attention and vigilant about national politics. I'm going to talk about the how we get there. Perhaps paradoxically, for Tocqueville, our effective and intelligent participation in national politics depends on things that happen closer to home. Most importantly, local self-government is the training ground for U.S. citizenship. And I'm going to talk about why that is and what the connection is between involvement in local government and being a good citizen at the national level. Because I think today, a lot of people are focused on their relationship with the national government and the state. You don't think much about the fact that you're a citizen of Missouri or a citizen of Arkansas or a citizen of Connecticut. And I do think that that's something that has changed since the time that Tocqueville was writing. But even though we were now more connected to the national government than we were when he wrote Democracy in America, I still think his analysis holds true about how you develop good habits of citizenship. So it's even more important that we pay attention to Tocqueville because what he recommended and what he prescribed as talking about how to build U.S. citizens is not happening as much as it was in the mid-19th century. Okay, so let's talk about what happens in when people get involved in local government. Why is that so important as a training ground of U.S. citizenship? Consider what happens when someone attends a town meeting or city council meeting. It could be a school board meeting. You can just pick your favorite example. Someone who attends a meeting or even runs for office and gets involved as a local official. That person comes to have an understanding of how the political process works. A few examples. You observe, even if you're just attending a school board meeting, you observe different points of view being taken into consideration, weighed, a final decision being reached. You also observe or engage in political compromise and come to appreciate the value of an orderly public meeting run according to fair and clear procedures. Again, the person who's involved in local government in some way has a front row seat to observe how public policy is made and how it's made and also its impact on individuals. Something that's, when you're immediately involved in something that's important to your local community, it's easier to see and trace the effects between what the school board does, as far as COVID policy is concerned and how that affects people. Whereas decisions that the national government makes are in many cases removed from our ordinary experience. So it can be harder to see the connection between a governmental decision and what happens in the real world and how it affects people. Although local and national issues do tend to differ, political lessons that you learn at the local level, and again, the examples that I gave above about observing compromise, fair procedures, orderly meetings, and whatnot. Those are just examples. Those political lessons you learn at the local level translate into how citizens relate to national politics. If local politics involves negotiation, compromise, harsh verbal exchanges, various processes and procedures, you're gonna have a better understanding of what might happen in national politics and have reasonable expectations about national politics. Of course, it can be a lot less messy if you want to develop theoretical ideas about politics on the basis of limited real-world experience. So, to just sit back and think about what politics should be like, rather than kind of becoming part of it and seeing how politics actually works. But real-world experience is necessary for cultivating citizens, again, who know how politics actually works and are thus capable of exercising sound judgment about important matters, even in difficult circumstances. Without opportunities to develop their judgment by making decisions about small local matters, individuals are going to be less likely to be good judges of big national issues, such as foreign policy and monetary policy. Moreover, without the political education provided by local self-government, individuals will lose the benefits of freedom because they won't have any methods for disciplining themselves politically or bringing order to the political sphere more generally. In this case, again, in a situation in which you have a people who has lots of ideas about freedom, lots of ideas about equality, but they don't have the practical experience necessary to bring order to their desires for freedom, especially. In that situation, Tocqueville says freedom will advance only through revolutions. So if you want people to enjoy freedom in an orderly, responsible way, they're going to have to figure out how to do that at the local level. Again, because the national government in most situations is just far removed from their experience, and they can't easily learn lessons of citizenship at the national level. Involvement in local self-government is not simply about political knowledge. It's also about political empowerment. When one works on some local issue, it doesn't even matter what it is. It could be, what's the theme of the winter festival going to be? It doesn't matter. It can be very small. But when you work on something, joining together with your fellow citizens, on whatever task you've taken at hand, you develop a sense of confidence that you can do things by working together with your fellow citizens. Merely seeing the connection, you don't even always have to get what you want or get your way to develop this sense of confidence. Merely seeing the connection between doing something and outcomes, even if you didn't get your preferred outcome, that's enough to convince the individual that his or her voice matters and that he or she can make a difference. And that's empowering. As with political knowledge, how kind of knowing how politics works can make you a better judge of national politics. That sense of empowerment that you develop at the local level can translate into your interactions with the national government. If you have developed confidence, working in things that are kind of within your grasp, as Tocqueville puts it, then you're more likely to try to interface with this sort of vast and intimidatingly complex national government. If you've honed your skills at the local level and developed confidence about your ability to negotiate politics and institutions at the local level. Local self-government, I'm emphasizing it because it's so important and so many lessons are learned there. And I'm going to mention another lesson now, which is that local self-government is the place where the self-interested character of American citizenship is first nurtured. Tocqueville observes, I have a long quotation from him, but I think it's significant. It is difficult to force a man out of himself and get him to take an interest in the affairs of the whole state, that is, the national government. For he has little understanding of the way in which the fate of the state can influence his own lot. But if it's a question of taking a road past his property, he sees at once that this small public matter has a bearing on his greatest private interests, and there's no need to point out to him the close connection between his private profit and the general interest. So self-interest is the driving factor for Americans getting involved in politics, at least initially. and it's the predominant motive that Americans have when they engage in national politics. Tocqueville argues that Americans love their country because of what it does for them, and ultimately because they view it as their own work. In other words, they love their country for the intermingled reasons of self-interest and pride. The American understands the connection between the structure of the national government and his own self-interest. And again, the reason that he's able to understand this is in part that he's seen the connection between his own self-interest and local government. So he's seen that relationship between self-interest and public policy up close. And so it's easier for him to see it at the national level. So the American understands the connection between how our national institutions are structured and his own self-interest. For example, the national government he sees is powerful enough to protect him and to perform the other basic functions of state. That was one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation, is that the Articles of Confederation were too weak to do anyone any good. So the American can appreciate the fact that the Constitution creates institutions that can be respected because again, they provide for the common defense and they perform the other basic functions of state. However, so the national government is strong, but the law also permits the individual the freedom to produce his own well-being, or to contribute to the production of his own well-being. So when the American thinks about the laws, he says, yes, the political system is strong and powerful, but it's not too strong to the point that it's oppressive, but it allows me freedom. So it's a good combination of security and protection on the one hand, and allowing me to do what I want and become prosperous on the other. So for this reason, Tocqueville says it's only rational for Americans to support their political system. It's only rational for them to be patriotic and rally around the flag, because they understand that it contributes very directly. What the national government does and how it's structured contributes very directly to their well-being. Tocqueville says, in the United States, the native country makes itself felt everywhere. It is an object of solicitude from the village to the entire Union. The inhabitant applies himself to each of the interests of the country as to his very own. He is glorified in the glory of the nation. In the success that it obtains, he believes he recognizes his own work, and he is uplifted by it. He rejoices in the general prosperity from which he profits. He has for his native country a sentiment analogous to the one that he feels for his family, and it is by a sort of selfishness that he takes an interest in the state. However, selfishness sounds bad, and so you can be critical of the idea of selfishness, and Tocqueville knows that people are going to push back on him. But he also points out that Americans understanding that the national government promotes their self-interest, it's not a crude understanding of self-interest, because Americans' selfishness in supporting the Union leads them to contribute to a cause larger than themselves. It's not just about my prosperity, or that's my primary motive. But when I get involved in national affairs or in local affairs, that also has the effect of contributing to the general prosperity. It's not a narrowly focused selfishness. Among the fruits of this self-interested involvement, among the fruits of these efforts is a feeling of pride in what you've accomplished by working together with other people, as well as a sense of ownership over your work, again, at the local as well as the national level. So you're motivated to participate in politics as a result of self-interest, and by doing that, you develop a sense of pride in your country as well as ownership over national politics. And Tocqueville thinks that that's a good thing, because pride and a sense of ownership leads you to further investment and further efforts. I mentioned that Tocqueville anticipates that, or I alluded to the fact that Tocqueville anticipates that people are going to push back on him, because he's essentially defending a selfish form of patriotism or something like that. But he discourages us, people who would be inclined to not to spurn this calculating form of patriotism just because it's rooted in selfishness and self-interest. In his view, to expect more than this of modern peoples who are enlightened and accustomed to various creature comforts is naive. And again, that's not to say that some people can't rise above the level of selfishness. And Tocqueville acknowledges that a lot of Americans don't give themselves credit for actually being public-spirited. But again, he says you can't count on people to be self-sacrificing and pursue the common good when it comes into conflict with their interests. And so don't spurn this self-interested form of patriotism, because at the very least it has people connected to politics and involved in politics. And if that's how you have to do it, then that's what we're going to do in the modern world. Before I conclude by discussing the consequences of a failure to cultivate liberal democratic citizenship, I want to make one final point about this liberal democratic citizenship, and that's a point about what binds citizens to one another. We talked about this a little bit ago when we talked about the traditional, or the idea of citizens being bound to one another, when we talked about the traditional concept of Republican or democratic citizenship, which is that bonds would be close and intimate, and people would be similar to one another. Americans, again, as you all know, Americans are not united by similarity of background. However that background is defined, whether it's race, ethnicity, religion, or even national origin. But those are the kinds of things that have historically bound citizens to one another in many other nations throughout human history. Those are the kinds of categories, ethnicity, religion, and whatnot, that provide the basis of many nations. So again, those categories link citizens to one another, or have historically, and have served as the basis of membership in various political communities. But that's an option that's off the table for the United States. And so the question is, is there a way that American citizens are united to one another, since all those other options are off the table? And I'm going to suggest that there is. There is a basis for national unity. And in order to talk about this, which is going to be, it's right on theme with Constitution Day, I'm going to draw on one of the great intellectual heirs of Alexis de Tocqueville, he's French. His name, the pronunciation of his name is either Raymond Aron if you're American, or a native English speaker, or Raymond Aron if you speak French. So I'm going to draw on this basic, he's a lot of other things, but he's a Tocqueville scholar and commentator, to talk about what binds Americans to one another. And it's part of the motivation for citizenship. So Aron rightly argues that what binds Americans to one another is simply a shared political way of life. That's what we have in common, is a shared political way of life. And specifically, so that's a general characterization. We share a political way of life. Well, what does that mean? Specifically, it means two things. First of all, it means a shared commitment to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as well as an adherence to the Constitution as the mechanism that serves to secure the goals of the Declaration of Independence. Aron says the rights of man asserted in the Declaration are the principle and the finality of the U.S. Constitution. So there's a connection between the Declaration and the Constitution. Commenting on the history of immigration to the U.S., which is of course far from spotless, Aron notes the attainment of full citizenship theoretically on an equal footing with the original Anglo-Americans by a large number of diverse individuals. And in many cases, if you just look at Americans and think about their backgrounds and whatnot, the only thing that they have in common is the fact that they live under the same political regime. Aron says, or he asks, what do Mexicans, Poles, and Sicilians have in common? Every ethnic group concentrated in a neighborhood and separated from the others. What makes all of them Americans, if not adherence to the Constitution? So I just wanted to mention that because it addresses the question of, or it's a response to the doubt that modern conceptions of citizenship don't have a way to bind people together. Actually, they do. It's going to be, as Jerome puts it, political rather than historical or ethnic. But as a source of unity, the Constitution of the United States and the Declaration of Independence are far from nothing. It's a big deal to be committed to those sets of political principles rather than other sets of political principles. All right, let me just say a few words in conclusion about what happens if we don't work to develop and cultivate liberal democratic citizenship. The Anti-Federalists doubted that a large country could be governed in accordance with Republican principles. The Federalists countered that their Constitution was in fact a Republican Constitution. They said, look, all the institutions of our national government derive either directly or indirectly from the people, even the Supreme Court. And so, it's a new form of Republican government, a novelty in the political world, as Madison says in Federalist 14, but the old Republican governments weren't so great after all. They were very unstable. So we've tinkered with the concept of Republican government, and we've come up with a new model, but it's still Republican. It's still government by the people. So there's this debate again about whether the United States whether the Constitution really creates a Republican form of government. And I think that the Federalists are correct that even though it's a new model, the Constitution still creates what could be classified as a Republican form of government for the U.S. But be that as it may, the Anti-Federalists were still right to worry that it was going to be an ongoing challenge to ensure that in being kept at a distance from the national government, the people did not eventually lose their rights to the tyranny of a central national government. And again, they're worried that the national government is eventually going to engulf the states and overwhelm individuals and the institutions of civil society by just imposing a uniform standard across the entire country. And so the Anti-Federalists are right that that's a reasonable worry to have about a Republican form of government that's structured like ours. Tocqueville reminds us that if the people's enlightenment and energy are not continually refreshed by local self-government and other things like the associations of civil society, people are going to become increasingly unwilling to assume the burdens of citizenship at the national level, despite the fact that these are relatively modest expectations and relatively reasonable burdens of citizenship. If people are not willing to assume the burdens of citizenship at the national level, and again, they're willing to do that because they've learned to do so at the local level, the central administration is going to do more and more, and the people are going to do less for themselves. And a consequence, the people are going to become even less capable of doing things for themselves. They're going to become, the whole goal is to empower citizens, but if a central administration grows in power, citizens are going to be disempowered. If something like that happens, we're going to become what the Anti-Federalists feared the Constitution would make us, which is subjects rather than citizens. So we're going to be a nation of subjects rather than a nation of citizens. But Tocqueville, again, he's always reminding us that that outcome is a possibility, but it's not inevitable. However, avoiding an outcome like that, like the Anti-Federalists feared, is going to require the ceaseless efforts of those determined to promote the ceaseless efforts of those determined to promote the spirit of the city and a political system that needs it, but that does not automatically foster it. Thank you very much, and I'm open to take any questions that you might have.